learning. So on Tuesday, we talked about natural selection. Today, we're going to talk about natural selection as well, but we're going to kind of look at some case studies and how the environment can impact this process, right? So let's get started. All right, so after today's lesson, you should be able to explain how a change in the environment could result in a change in a certain species, and use a real world example and apply the concept of natural selection in that example in order to justify how a population's genotype can cause the frequency of a phenotype to change over time. And I'm going to do a quick recap on that because I know some of you were still a little confused on what those terms meant. So here's the question I want you to think about. How did the animal on the next slide get his amazing and wonderful camouflage? So you look at this picture, and if you look at it really quickly, you can't see, but there's a bug there. I know if you look a lot more closely, you can probably see it. If you can't see it, I'm just going to circle it for you just in case, because they do kind of blend in. That's the whole point, right? So this little thing that looks like a leaf, that's actually a bug, right? This being the tail end and this being its little head. So how did this happen? So the process of natural selection, right, that helps camouflage and things like that take place. So evolution is driven by natural selection. So this means that organisms that are best suited for their surroundings will survive, right, because they're best suited. They're more likely to reproduce at a higher rate. So they're going to end up making more offspring or children that are going to have those genes that are favorable in that environment, right? So this little guy that we talked about earlier, to get perfectly camouflaged to his environment, it was because predators are less likely to see him, which means he's more likely to reproduce and pass down those genes to future generations. Okay, so let's talk about the peppered moth. And some of you might know about this, but you will learn about this next year when you take Mr. Fong's world history class. So let's talk about some proof. So in England, a species of moth called the peppered moth had two available inheritable wing colors. Basically, there are two different alleles for wing colors, right? You could have the light wings or the dark wings, right? And obviously through genetics, dark colored moths had moth children with dark colored wings as well, right? Prior to the Industrial Revolution, the light color dominated with 99% of the moths displaying this phenotype, right? So 99% of those moths were showing that light colored wing. Now, once these factories opened, the light phenotype became almost extinct. We barely saw it. And the dark phenotype began to dominate. So what changed? What happened? Now, I know that for some of you, when you talk about dominant and recessive traits, some of you said dominants are the stronger traits. That's not actually it. A dominant trait just needs to have one allele to get expressed. A recessive trait needs to have two alleles to get expressed, right? So we're going to talk about why we think there was this shift. Now, as you can see in this picture over here, this is a light colored moth that might have been a little bit hidden, but this is actually a light colored moth against that tree. This is a dark colored moth, right? So we'll get to that in a minute. So dark versus light variants, let's look at it. So we have light moth, dark moth. Okay, we can see them clearly. Now, when we look at this picture, it is pretty clear that that light colored moth sticks out a lot more on that tree, whereas that dark colored moth blends in more. And the opposite is also true. So if we have a light colored tree, our light colored moth blends in more and our dark colored moth starts to stand out. So if we look at the year 1848, only about 5% of the moth population were dark. The other 95 were light. We look at 1895. This is after the Industrial Revolution. 98% are now dark and 2% are light. That's a huge switch. That's a huge jump. And that's not a lot of time if you really think about it. It's less than 50 years, okay? So what happened? Well, the Industrial Revolution was like, hey, let's build a lot of things, let's make things. And all of that soot, that dark stuff that kind of got released by burning all these fuels, that caused a layer to get formed on the tree trunks. And so those tree trunks that were once lighter now appear darker, which means that the dark-winged moths could blend in and camouflage in their environment more easily. So predators had a harder time of finding them. Now, that doesn't mean predators didn't find them at all, but predators had a harder time finding them. That also means they were more likely to survive, and most importantly, they were more likely to reproduce because they were living longer lives. Okay, now that's 1895. Let's look at 1995. Now, this is 100 years later, so this is a pretty huge jump. Why have we seen this shift? So if you look at that, now you're like, okay, 19% dark, 81% light colored moths. What happened? Well, what happened is realistically, globally, we tried to do things that controlled our emissions, right? We tried to do things that are not adding to this problem of pollution and smog in this industrial world that we live in now. So between 1895 and 1995, there were a lot of laws and things that got passed, and also advancements in technology to make it so we weren't just releasing all of this coal and all of those harmful pollutants in the air and in the environment. All right, so just to recap real fast, what was the selection factor? Early 1800s, this is before the Industrial Revolution. Again, we were looking at England, doesn't matter. Low pollution, we had lichen, which is this light, almost similar to a moss, but it's a food source, growing on trees, light colored bark. That's what it looked like. Okay, late 1800s, similar to what we talked about, we had the Industrial Revolution. There was a lot of soot, as I said, that covered the trunks of those trees, killed the lichen, didn't grow anymore, and it caused that bark to turn dark, right? And so again, then we had that switch in the mid 1900s where we were able to control that pollution, either with technology and or laws, and make sure that that lichen came back and the light colored bark returned as well. So that was just a little recap of what I said about in the previous slide. Okay. All right. So another example of natural selection, kind of in action, is this idea of insecticides and drug resistance. Basically, it's this idea that the more that we are exposing certain insects or bugs, let's say, to pesticides, a couple of them might live, right? Things are only 99% effective, let's say. Let's say that's the best we have. We still have 1% of the population that will live. Now, that's kind of dangerous because that means that 1% that's super strong and was able to not get affected by those pesticides was able to live and reproduce and create more super strong gene bugs, those types of things, right? So we know that insecticides didn't kill all of them, and the resistant survivors reproduce. So over here, I'm just going to use this to mark this up for you for a second. So if let's say we're applying this insecticide, we're flying over crops, we're applying this insecticide, the one that has this allele, and they made it red, it doesn't matter, right? But the allele that allows them to survive, they're going to live. And with them living, they are more likely to now reproduce and pass that down, right? So it's this idea of almost like building up a tolerance. We have to make sure that the insecticides or the pesticides we're using are getting stronger and stronger because these bugs in this case are building up a resistance to that pesticide or that drug, okay? So a few things to talk about. Why do some species evolve and others go extinct? And the biggest reason is time. If changes occur super, super quick, there's not enough time that will allow a species to evolve and adapt and natural selection to kind of take place, okay? That's what we see. And that's actually something that we're kind of concerned about now because many biologists think we're in a sixth mass extinction where the majority of the animals are actually currently in the process of becoming extinct, okay? The other thing that you have to consider too is you also need to think about those 4 principles of natural selection that have to be in place for evolution to occur. We have to have a large population size of those organisms, right? Because we need a bunch of different organisms that can reproduce together. And we also need them to have a bunch of different types of DNA and genetic material to mix and give us new combinations, right? Again, going to that second part, we need those variations of traits and those alleles. And there has to be some sort of competition for resources like food, water, shelter, those types of things. The reproduction rate is also going to play a big piece because if we have only, let's say, 3 of a certain type of animal, they're not going to be able to reproduce as much as if we had 3,000 animals, right? So it's kind of looking at those things. I just wanted to give you that case study of the peppered moth, and hopefully you're able to kind of see how that genotype influenced how often we saw that trait appear, that phenotype, right? Remembering the difference, genotype being DNA, the genetic material an organism has, phenotype being the physical and observable expression of that material, All right. I hope this has helped. If not, you can always ask me questions. Check in office hours. I would love to see you there. Have a lovely rest of your day.